I had to get married. Now that's a bald statement if ever there was one. Isn't it? Well, takes two to tango, I suppose, so I should have said that we had to get married. Maddie and I, as otherwise it could have been a bit lonely, stood up there on my own. Even that's a bald statement and is only a half-truth, as if we hadn't wanted to anyway. Then it just wouldn't have happened. James, Maddie, my regular girlfriend for the last 12 months or so, spoke out one fine Friday evening. I've got some news for you. Good news or bad? I smiled back, eyeing up my 5'6"-ish, blondish, slimish, rather gorgeous significant other. Not sure, James. Maddie grinned at me a little nervously. Could be either. Depends on you, really. Don't have to report the rest of the conversation to show you where that conversation was going. Suffice to say that a few moments later we were in one another's arms, declaring our love for one another and trying to decide when I would transform my newly pregnant girlfriend into my newly pregnant wife. Any time to suit your family, Maddie offered. I've not really got any family left now that Auntie Beth has died, and I haven't got anyone back in Leicester that I'm still particularly friendly with. It was true. Sad maybe, but true. Poor Maddie had lost both parents as a child in a motorcycling accident, and after some early fostering, had eventually been raised by Auntie Beth, a long-term friend of Maddie's late mother, just outside Leeds. Poor Auntie Beth had passed away herself just a few weeks previously before I'd even so much as got to meet her. I'd been away in Canada on business when she died, and by the time I'd got back, Maddie had been up to Leeds for the funeral and everything was done and buried, quite literally as it were. What about Beth's son, Maddie? I asked somewhat reluctantly, the conversation having been cut short by her on previous occasions when his name had come up. You used to be close to Tom, didn't you? Wouldn't you like him there on the day? Tom's in prison, James. Maddie shot back at me, her annoyance showing through. I've told you before. I don't want to talk about him. Oops, should have known better than to mention Tom. I knew he was serving time at Her Majesty's pleasure, but I didn't know why or where for that matter. Touchy subject. Better do a quick change of tack. My parents are both retired, so I think any date would suit them. The sooner the better then, James. My wife-to-be smiled back at me, patting her still flat tummy, and her anger forgotten. Let's ring them now. And so it came to pass. Just 4 weeks later, we were joined in matrimony at the registry office in Bedford where we were living, a small group of my family and our mutual friends in attendance. We went off to the West Indies where we had a wonderful honeymoon, but it was still several weeks after returning that Maddie's tummy began to show evidence of the arrival of our first child. Beth, that's what we called the little bundle of joy that eventually emerged screaming into this world, complete with a full set of fingers and toes and things, and a pair of lungs that promised a few sleepless nights. My mum's name was too long-winded and out of fashion, so our daughter was named after the woman who Maddie had looked upon as her mother. I thought that appropriate and Maddie loved me for it. Married life was great, and though I'm not saying we never had any disagreements, Maddie and I settled down well together, with our lovely little infant daughter. Beth was really quite blonde as she started to grow up, with even a touch of ginger in her hair when you saw it in the right light. Unlike my dark complexion and completely black hair, Maddie was a sort of dirty blonde, so Beth took after her side of the family. Little Beth, however, had more my disposition, seldom getting upset or indeed even crying, unlike Maddie, who had always been inclined to be a little emotional. A good mixture, some might think, the best of both sides, though I was never quite brave enough to suggest such a thing to my darling wife, of course. We'd been married nearly 4 years, and Beth had passed her 3rd birthday when suddenly not all was well in the Dawson household. Beth was her normal happy self, and I was more than content with life, but Maddie obviously had something on her mind. She had given up work shortly before Beth was born, and since I was making pretty good money, had never returned. By then we were living in a pretty little village to the north of Bedford, and 2 or 3 times a week Maddie took Beth into Bedford to do the shopping, take her to the clinic, or just meet up with her friends that she used to work with. Yes, and when I was around, we sometimes met for lunch, which was nice. But just lately she had been coming home in a very pensive mood from her trips into town, and there was obviously something bothering her. Maddie had been subject to moody periods in the first few weeks that we'd been going out together, after a mutual friend had introduced us. It was pretty obviously due to her concern that we were getting serious about one another pretty quickly, but she'd long since got that out of her system. I asked what the problem was, of course, but just got the old shake of the head treatment. I considered the possibility that she might be having an affair with some guy, but she always had Beth with her, so that didn't seem even a remote possibility. As it turned out, I was correct in that assumption, but maybe it might have been better if it had been just that. "What on earth is the matter, Maddie?" I eventually demanded more forcibly when she was really down in the dumps. She looked up at me and just stared sadly for quite some time before she spoke. "I guess I owe you an explanation, James. You're gonna find out soon anyway. So I might as well get it over with." "Find out what?" I asked, her words filling me with dread. Was she ill? Was there something wrong with our beautiful daughter? "Put Beth to bed, honey," she suggested with a sigh. "Then come down and we'll have a talk. Right?" I bundled little Beth up and took her upstairs, happy for once that she was so sleepy and not insisting on me staying on to read her a story. I wanted to get back down and find out what the problem was. If I'd known at that moment, then I would have stayed longer with Beth. Damn it, if I'd known what was going to happen, then I might never have left her bedroom. "Come and sit here, James," Maddie told me, indicating the chair the opposite side of the table to where she sat rather than alongside her, which was not an encouraging sign. "James, honey," she started, sighing deeply before continuing. "You've asked about Tom a number of times and I've never told you anything, have I?" "No," I agreed. "You always shut me down." "Well, it's time that I told you about Tom," Maddie went on in not much more than a whisper. "Tom is a couple of years older than me, and when I was younger he was just like an older brother after I went to live with him and his mother." "That sounds quite normal," I threw in to encourage her. "Yes, but as we got older, things changed, James," Maddie continued, avoiding my eyes. "We weren't actually related in any way and we became, well, like boyfriend and girlfriend." I simply nodded, wondering where this conversation was going, and suspecting that I wasn't going to like it. "Then as we got into our later teens, we became more than that. A whole lot more." "What did his mother make of that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level and trying not to dwell too much on what a whole lot more might mean. "She was all in favor. Tom was a bit of a wild boy like his father had been before he died on his motorbike. I've never told you, but the reason my parents and Tom's were so friendly was that they were all bikers. Hell's Angels and all. The whole lot." "Hell's Angels?" I cried out, totally caught by surprise. "Yes," Maddie replied. "All four of them. But your parents died in a biking accident as well, didn't they?" "Yes, they did," Maddie admitted sadly. "They were in a big group going down to Brighton for a weekend when they went round a corner too fast and wrote themselves off." "And Tom's dad?" I asked carefully, already knowing the details of her parents' demise, but surprised to hear that there was more to it. "That was just 4 months later on his way to work. He ended up under a lorry, and Auntie Beth had lost her husband and 2 best friends in such a short period that she never got on a bike again. She grew to hate the things." "Well, that's understandable," I sympathized, never having been a fan of the things myself. As far as I was concerned, anything on the road with only 2 wheels was either a bicycle if it didn't have an engine, or the front or back half of a car if it did. "That's when Auntie Beth took me in and brought me up as her own daughter," Maddie continued. "But she was in favor of Tom and you getting involved with one another." "Yes, she was," Maddie went on, her whole manner indicating that half her mind was back in those times. "As I said, Tom was a real wild one and desperately keen on motorbikes and rode them without any fears just like his dad. Beth hated the thought of what might happen to him, and I guess she thought that I might be a good influence on him." "And were you?" "I guess not," Maddie sighed. "In fact, quite the reverse, and I ended up as wild as Tom was. We were part of a motorbike gang and got up to all sorts of things that we shouldn't be doing. Quite a lot of it things that the law said we shouldn't be doing." "You mean like speeding?" I questioned her. "Oh yes, that all right, but an awful lot more as well. We all got quite a reputation with the local police." "So that's how Tom got put away, was it?" I surmised aloud, still trying to take in the news that my darling sweet young wife had once been a biker bird. At least that might explain the tattoo on her bum that she'd never been keen to give an explanation for. Maddie didn't answer straight away, but just sat there looking as if she was gathering the strength to tell me something. Sort of, she mumbled at last, and I waited for her to expand. We were out one evening with the bike club, and on our way back from Manchester when we stopped off to meet up with another group that we knew. Tom was on his new Honda with me on the back, and I was desperate for him to let me have a go with it. I didn't actually have a full bike license, though I had ridden the less powerful Suzuki that he'd had before, but I'd never tried anything as heavy and powerful as his new bike, so he wasn't keen. That upset me, so like a fool, I started to flirt with another biker called Mike who rode with the other gang. I knew he'd always fancied me and had tried it on a few times. Since I'm being honest here, I'll admit that me and him had had a bit of history when Tom hadn't been around. Never gone too far with him, mind you, but we had got way beyond simply kissing a few times. I can hardly believe what I'm hearing, Maddie, I gasped. I found it almost impossible that the mother of my child could ever have acted like that. It was all a few years ago, James, she responded with a contrite look. I'm a few years older and an awful lot wiser than I was then, honey. You sure you want me to continue? Yes, carry on, Maddie, I told her. This was all before I knew you. I have to admit I'm surprised by all this, but it doesn't affect how I feel about you. My wife let out another huge sigh and smiled sadly at me, but otherwise remained silent, and I had to gesture to her again to carry on with her story. Well, Tom, bless him, got pretty jealous about the way I was carrying on, and the two gangs were getting a bit fractious with one another. There was going to be trouble, but me, silly little cow that I was, just carried on enjoying the fuss that I was causing. Eventually Tom came and tried to pull me away from Mike, but I wasn't giving in. I told Mike that Tom was being mean to me and wouldn't let me have a go on his Honda, and would he let me try his Kawasaki out. There was no chance really, as Mike's bike was even more powerful than the Honda, but he played along with it. He let you ride it?
No.
I said there was no chance, but he wanted me to get on the back with him and take off. 2 or 3 of their friends were sort of backing them both up, but trying to calm them down as well. But then Mike pushed his luck even further and told me that if I'd strip off topless and go for a ride on the back with him, then he'd let me have a go afterwards. Topless? I cried out incredulously. What made the idiot think you'd do that? Because I'd done it before, James. Several times? She shocked me with. Only ever on the back with Tom, of course, but a couple of times at bike rallies. I'd done the tour round completely naked. It was nothing exceptional in that crowd, and quite a few girls did it, flashing everything they had. I'm having difficulty in taking all this in, Maddie, I told her, shaking my head as my tummy turned somersaults. This doesn't sound like the girl I met and married. I've told you, James, I'm older and wiser now, but at the time it was, well, fun. I finished for her, to which she nodded and carried on, trying to keep up the wan smile on her face. Tom didn't react till I'd actually got my leather jacket and my t-shirt off and was reaching behind to undo my bra. Then he grabbed me and screamed that if that's what it took, then I could ride his damn Honda. You would have taken your bra off? I asked her in some disbelief. I was shocked by her disclosures, but have to admit that I was more excited by her display than the bike riding bit, and the picture of Maddie in my mind stripping off like that was having some effect on me. You know what I mean, don't you? Yes, she answered simply. And you would have bared your tits to them all? Yes. And gone off with him? Not sure, but probably. But I was hoping Tom would give in first. Christ, Maddie, I mumbled. You were a real bitch back then, weren't you? I guess I was, she answered calmly. But you have to understand that in a crowd like that, then guys are kings and the girls are treated almost like possessions, in public if not in private. When a girl got a chance to lord it over one of the guys, then it was a real rush. I suppose that's one reason why there were so many fights over women. So he let you have a go of the Honda then? I questioned, though to be honest I was still more interested in whether she'd gone ahead and taken her bra off at that point. That was soon to change, however. Yes, she went on. I put my jacket back on, gave Mike a kiss on the cheek to piss off Tom, but then went with him to his Honda. He was pretty furious with me, but still kept his word, and a few minutes later I was cruising slowly round the car park with Tom on the back. I was loving it, and by then I think even Tom was getting okay with it, as I was doing really well. Then everything went to pot. What happened? I demanded impatiently. I guess I'd pissed Mike off as well, and he followed on his Kawasaki and started to cut me up. Tom was getting angry and told me to stop, but of course I knew better and began to go faster. Then Mike left the car park and went roaring off down the road, and despite Tom screaming at me, I took off after him. At this point, I couldn't help but notice that tears were forming in Maddie's eyes, and she looked to be on the point of bursting into tears. I moved around and put my arm around her, telling her to take her time, but she shook her head and carried on, beginning to sob as she finished her story. Mike went faster and faster, and like the idiot I was, I chased after at him. It was exhilarating, and I ignored Tom shouting at me to stop and carried on. At this point, Maddie did burst into tears, sobbing so pitifully that I couldn't understand what she was telling me, and it took a few more minutes before she could finish her tale. By then I'd guessed that it wasn't going to end happily, and I sure wasn't wrong. Mike dropped back and rode alongside us, encouraging me to go faster and faster, while Tom was going crazy on the back, pounding me on the back to get me to slow down. But I didn't. I tried to get past Mike. I didn't make it though. I lost control. What happened, Maddie? I asked her gently, holding her as she cried aloud, remembering what was quite obviously an awful experience. The Honda slid from under me and crashed into Mike's machine. I wasn't aware what happened then, and the next thing I remembered was waking up in hospital some time later, having been in a coma of some sort. I had a pretty severe bump on the head, but fortunately for Tom, he came off more or less unscathed. And this Mike character? I demanded. What happened to him, Maddie? Dead. Dead. Yes, dead. Shit. Exactly. But what happened then, sweetheart? I don't understand. You were riding the bike and Tom was just a passenger. How did he end up in prison? He took the blame, James, she sobbed. By the time I came to and became able to realize what was happening around me, it was too late. Tom told the police that it was him in the front seat, and he got the blame. But it wasn't him, Maddie, I protested. It was you. I know. But why would he do that, sweetheart? I searched for an explanation. Why would he take the blame? Because he loved me, she stated simply. I was his woman and he wanted to protect me. Shit. Exactly. The pair of us had had enough by then, and neither of us wanted to talk about it any further. So we cuddled up on the sofa and said nothing for what seemed an awful long time. Eventually I knew that there was more to this story and I had to know it all. What else do you have to tell me, Maddie? I asked at last. There must be more to Tom's actions than you've told me so far. You're right, of course, Maddie admitted. At the time, believe it or not, Tom had a clean sheet with the police. He'd been pulled over a number of times and had speeding fines and things, but nothing more than that. After the accident, apparently Mike didn't seem too bad. So Tom didn't think too much would come of it, and told the police that he'd been on the driving seat. Unlike Tom, I did have a couple of convictions and he was worried they'd throw the book at me. So thinking it wasn't too serious, he took the blame. You had 2 convictions? I blurted out, wondering what other revelations there were going to be. Christ, Maddie, were you a criminal of some kind? Not exactly, James. Maddie grinned at me guiltily. I told you the sort of things I used to get up to. They were both for indecent exposure. What? Riding round in the nude on the back of a bike on a camping site was one thing, but the cops didn't take kindly to us doing it through the middle of town. Twice? I queried. More than twice, Maddie whispered. I got caught 3 times, but they let me off the first time. I didn't know if I could take much more of this, but she went on to explain how Mike had taken a sudden turn for the worse and unexpectedly pegged out, and Tom had stuck to his story to protect Maddie. His case got bungled when it went to court and he ended up with an unexpectedly long sentence. Sounds like you owe this Tom guy a lot, Maddie, I sighed when she stopped. When is he due out? That's the problem, James. He still has several years to go, but I've just discovered that he's getting a remission for good behavior and will be getting out pretty soon. When? Thursday, she surprised me with. The day after tomorrow. That's why I've been upset for the last couple of weeks. Christ, what a mess. I put my head in my hands and thought for a while. Maddie really owed this guy an Awful lot, and dubious though I was, I knew I couldn't just ask her to abandon him after what he'd done for her. I didn't like it. I didn't like it one little bit, but she was my wife. I loved her, and I knew what had to be done. The poor bastard. While he'd been in the nick for something he hadn't even done, his mother had died and his girl had married someone else. I don't suppose he's got anywhere to go when he gets out, has he? I asked, praying silently that my supposition was not correct. Not really, she disappointed me. His mum's house was only rented and he's lost touch with his old friends up in Leeds. Hang on a minute. I was missing something here. How do you know that, Maddie? I questioned her. How do you know so much about him if he's in prison up north somewhere? He's not up north, James. Maddie answered me so softly that I could hardly hear her. He was, but he got into some fights up there and they transferred him. Where to? I asked, knowing what the answer would be, before the words had left my mouth. Bedford, she mumbled. Right here in Bedford prison. Some bloody coincidence that, I remarked sarcastically. Sorry, James, honey. I know I should have told you long ago, but I kept avoiding it and it simply got more and more impossible to tell you. I felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of it. So your frequent trips into Bedford were to visit him then? Not all the time, but… She shrugged her shoulders but didn't finish, the tears still slowly rolling down her cheek, as we stood there staring at one another, wondering what to say next. I moved down here to be near him, James. I thought everything would work out, but I didn't reckon on meeting someone else, honey. I didn't reckon on meeting you. I just didn't allow for falling in love with another man. What are we going to do now then, Maddie? I don't know, James. As I said before, I knew what had to be done. I didn't even know the guy, but Maddie owed him badly and she was my wife. Time to be magnanimous. Look, Maddie, I started. I don't like the idea, but I suppose he could come and stay here for a few days. Long enough for him to find somewhere. Perhaps we can help him out with a few bob to get him started. Can't do that, James. Why not? I demanded, a little relieved that she didn't think it was a good idea, in truth. I don't think that would suit him, James. Why the hell not? I bristled, considering that my offer had been pretty damn understanding in the circumstances. He doesn't know about you, James. He doesn't. Tom doesn't know I'm married, James. I'm so sorry, honey, but I never had the guts to tell him. And he still thinks that I'm waiting for him to get out. I've made a right mess of it all, haven't I? Oh shit. Exactly. The rest of the evening was a bit of a nightmare. The pair of us skirting round one another while we tried to work out in our own brains what to do. When we eventually got round to talking again, I tried to make it clear that she'd have to tell Tom the truth on her next visit, as the longer she left it, then the harder it would get. I was really pissed at her for being so stupid, especially when she was such an organized and forthright person normally. But Maddie was my wife. I loved her to pieces, and of course I had our daughter Beth to think of. Yes, Beth. Now there was the thing. I realized that Maddie still obviously had strong feelings for Tom, even though I hadn't pushed her on the point. But Maddie and I had Beth together, so I wasn't worried where her long-time commitment lay. What I really wanted to do was to insist that she tell this Tom guy to bugger off, but deep down I knew that it would be a mistake. Maddie had to work this out of her system herself, and my job was to help her do that. The next day, the day before his release, Beth went off to visit Tom and to tell him the truth. It wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done, and I took the day off to be there when she came home, knowing that she'd need my support. I waited at home, my insides trying to turn themselves inside out, wondering what state she would be in when she returned. Hi, Maddie. I greeted her at the door as she walked up our garden path. How did it go? How did Tom take it? He didn't, she answered, somewhat puzzlingly as she slid past me. What do you mean, he didn't? I didn't tell him, James, Maddie replied without looking at me. He was so excited, like the best day in his life. I just couldn't do it, James. I just couldn't break his heart when he was so happy. For God's sake, Maddie. I started in on her angrily. You think it's going to be any easier for him tomorrow? You think he's going to be any less upset? Grow up, you silly woman. I'm not going to tell him tomorrow, Tom. Maddie hit me with, I've made up my mind, James. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to give him a few days of happiness before I destroy him. That's the least that I owe him, James, whatever it costs me. I stood there with my mouth gaping open as the implications of what my wife was saying sunk in. A few days of happiness? I queried anxiously. Yes, James, she responded, at last looking up with a determined look on her face. I've booked a hotel room in town for tomorrow night, and I fully intend to give Tom some payback for what he has done for me. No bloody way, Maddie, I shouted at her. If you think I'm going to stand by while another man beds my wife, then you've got another think coming. Christ, woman, I know you owe him, but this is ridiculous. You can't stop me, James, she screamed back at me. It's my decision, my body, and I'll do what I know is right. I owe him so much, James. Please try to understand. I understand, okay. You're going to let another man fuck you. It isn't going to happen, Maddie. It just isn't going to happen. I've made my mind up, James. No bloody way, Maddie. I'm doing it, James, honey. Please, why can't you understand? Then I might not be here when you come home, Maddie, I threatened. You let him fuck you just once and our marriage will be down the pan. I was hoping you'd be more understanding, James. She began to plead with me. You know the situation I'm in and I have to do this. Please, James. Please try to understand. There's nothing to understand, I shouted angrily. Then there's nothing to talk about, she screamed back. Damn you, James. Why can't you understand? I'm not taking anything away from you. Damn you too. You do it and we're finished. Fuck you, you miserable bastard. She finished and fled the room, slamming the door behind her and leaving me standing there bewildered. And that was it. I tried to talk to her later that evening, but when it was clear that I wasn't relenting in any way, she just shut me down. I felt like strangling the silly cow and couldn't believe that she couldn't see what she was doing to our relationship. And what about Beth? Oh, Jesus. What about poor Beth, who was about to have her life torn apart? I got up fairly early, having slept in the spare bedroom, got Beth up and dressed and made her breakfast. I didn't intend to hang around to watch Maddie go off to carry out her act of adultery, and planned to take Maddie out for the day so we wouldn't be there. Another day off work. But what the hell? I'll see you sometime tomorrow, James, Maddie mumbled to me as she kissed and fussed over Beth as I made ready to leave. Maybe, maybe not, I grunted unhappily, pushing her away as she tried to give me a kiss as well. Please don't be like this, James, she all but sobbed. It'll all be all right, honey. I promise you. It won't be all right, Maddie. Please change your mind. What's up with Mummy? Beth broke in as her mother started to cry. She's just being stupid, sweetheart, I answered her, whisking her up into my arms and storming out without another word. All considered, my day with Beth wasn't too bad, starting with a trip to the zoo at Whipsnade and ending somewhat predictably at McDonald's. I decided that I really ought to spend more time taking my daughter out, though the prospect of perhaps doing it on my own in the future didn't exactly appeal. I tried. I really tried to see Maddie's side of the problem and could understand how hard it was for her. However, try as I may, I couldn't go along in any way with her actions. Then I tried to put myself in Tom's position and found myself struggling there. Poor sod had gone to prison for his love of a woman, and what had the cow done to him? Bloody hell, what a mess. When will Mummy be home, Daddy? My little daughter asked when we got home. She's gone away for the night, sweetheart, I told her, trying to keep it lighthearted. She'll be back soon. Who's she gone with, Daddy? Just a friend, I replied, not wishing to expand. Is it Tom? She then shocked me with, never considering the possibility that my daughter would know anything about him. How do you know about Tom? I asked nervously. Mummy and I go and visit him, Daddy, when we go into Bedford. It's not very nice where he lives, but Mummy says he can't come and live with us because the men there says he has to stay where he is. I looked at my little daughter in disbelief. What a bitch was my loving wife turning out to be behind my back. Not only had she deceived both Tom and me, but she had taken our daughter, my daughter, to see the bastard in that damn prison. I was beginning to wonder if I knew my wife at all. Mummy said that Tom would be getting out soon, Daddy. Beth carried on. What does getting out mean? It means that he won't have to live in that nasty place anymore, sweetheart. I told her without thinking. Oh, good, she replied. He's really nice, is Tom. Will he be able to come and live with us then? I don't think so, Beth, I responded sadly. I just don't think that would be possible. That evening was terrible, and I simply didn't want to put my daughter to bed. One of those rare occasions when she actually had to tell me she was tired and wanted to go to sleep. In the end, she fell asleep in my arms, and I held her for some time before I eventually relented and took her up to her bedroom, not relishing the thought of having to spend the rest of that evening on my own. The telephone call didn't help, of course. Hi, honey, Maddie greeted me when I reluctantly picked up the phone. What do you want? I answered gruffly. Please don't be like that, James, she pleaded. I'm just ringing to make sure you're both okay. Beth's fine, I told her. She's up in bed. How about you, James? Maddie croaked. Are you okay? Has he fucked you yet? I demanded angrily, ignoring her question. Please, James. Has he fucked you yet? I repeated even louder, interrupting her. James. Answer the damn question, will you?
Ich screamte her.
Yes, he has, Maddie vented back at me. He's fucked me twice already and will do again when he gets back. Well, I hope you damn well enjoyed it, you cheating bitch. I did, she shouted down the phone at me, her temper matching mine. What's more, he's got a bigger cock than you and knows how to please a woman. A silence followed that statement as I recoiled from what she said. And, I guess, she realized quite what she'd said to me. James, honey, she cried out desperately after a few moments. I didn't mean to say that, honey. I swear I didn't. I don't know how she finished that sentence. My ego shot to hell and back and my heart breaking into little pieces. I slowly and purposefully put the phone back down on the cradle and stood there staring at it, tears forming in my eyes. Of course, it started to ring again just a few seconds later, but I grabbed the cable and ripped it from the socket. When my mobile started to beep a minute or so afterwards, I fumbled to find the off button, failed, and threw the thing with all my strength straight against the wall. It stopped beeping as it shattered, and I stood there in silence, by then full-sized tears streaming down my cheek. I stood there and sobbed. Sobbed while my wife waited for her lover to return and service her. Sobbed as the desolate loneliness engulfed me, hating the world and just about everything in it. I must have stood there for an hour or more, half wondering, and in all honesty half hoping that Maddie would turn up and make it all better. But that wouldn't have been possible, would it? And sure enough, she didn't come back. It wasn't till I thought of my little Beth that I began to galvanize myself, realizing that I'd have to be brave for her. She was all I had as far as I was concerned, and it gave me the will to carry on. I made myself a cup of tea, the solution to all evils, and sat there reflecting on how my life was about to change. Would I take Maddie back? God, what a question. All my senses told me a no. But my heart spoke otherwise, almost in a different language, and one that I could hardly understand. The only thing that I could be sure of was that I had to be strong for Beth's sake. I would fight to the ends of the earth to keep her with me, whatever Maddie tried. I found myself thinking that I'd even take Maddie back for Beth's sake. But who was I kidding? I wanted my Maddie back for my own sake, whatever she'd done. But I knew it'd never be the same. It wouldn't work and it wasn't going to happen. And I started to well up again as I thought about the disruption that was about to happen to the poor little sweet girl who was sleeping soundly upstairs, unaware of the turmoil around her. Damn you, Maddie, why did you have to do this to the people who love you? I awoke the following morning with something stroking my face. Wake up, Daddy, I heard through my fuddled brain. Why didn't you go to bed last night? Morning, sweetheart, I greeted her sleepily. I just fell asleep on the sofa and forgot to go to bed. Silly Daddy? Beth giggled at me. Mummy will think you're silly when I tell her. I think Mummy already thinks I'm a fool, I replied, sighing deeply as the situation settled down heavily again upon my overloaded shoulders. Daddy's taken a day off work to look after you again. Where do you want to go? Can we go to the zoo, please, Daddy? My little one cried out joyfully, clapping her hands together. But we went there yesterday, honey bunch, I pointed out to her. But I want to go again, Daddy, she giggled back at me. I want to see the big elephants and the funny monkeys and, what do they call those big ones with the long funny neck, Daddy? Giraffes, sweetheart, I answered her. But you saw them all yesterday. How about we go to Old Warden and see the old aeroplanes? Do they have lions and tigers and things there? No, Beth, they don't, I explained to her, quite fancying a trip to the old aeroplane museum that I hadn't been to for years, if only to take my mind off things. But they do have lots of other interesting things. Do they have a McDonald's there, Daddy? I explained that they probably didn't, but that we could find one on the way home, and that about settled it. Yes. Half an hour later, we were on our way back to the zoo. It was a good day, and for several hours I was more or less able to forget my woes and revel in the enjoyment of my daughter. Perhaps she would be a vet when she grew up. It was okay right till we left McDonald's, full of triple something or other burgers and foamy milkshakes, that the cloud began to descend yet again. How the heck could I mess this all up? How could I break up our marriage and ruin little Beth's life? Maybe Maddie and I could get over her transgression, and in a few years the problems with Tom would all be a distant memory. Maybe. By the time we got home, little Beth was ready for sleep. So we cuddled up on the sofa again, and for the second night in a row, I ended up carrying her sleeping form upstairs. So far, so good. But then I had to wait on my own to see what time Maddie came back. We hadn't discussed it, so I had no idea when she'd come home. Damn it, we'd done nothing but scream at one another since she'd announced her plans. I made myself promise that when she did, then I would hold my temper and try to talk sensibly. Deep down, I could sort of understand why she felt she had to do what she had to do, but she had to understand my point of view. I had serious doubts whether we could get over what I could only see as her cheating on me, but for Beth's sake I would give it my best shot. But only if she did as well. I waited for 9 o'clock, somehow or other convinced that that was the time she'd be back by. Then I waited for 10 and started to get really pissed off again. At 20 past 10, the reconnected phone rang. Hello, James Dawson here, I answered cautiously. Are you in a better mood than you were last night, James? The voice on the other end demanded. Not a lot, Maddie, I replied. When are you coming home? Depends on you, James, she said, instantly reminding me of that fateful day when she'd first told me she was pregnant with Beth. If I come back in the morning, are you going to talk to me sensibly and not scream at me? Tomorrow morning, I shot back at her. You're due back tonight. Plans changed, James, she announced. Now, are you going to be rational about this or not? I counted to 5 to control my temper before replying. Have you told him yet? I asked, ignoring her question. Does he know about us being married? Yes, James, he does. And he took it quite well, all things considered. Maddie informed me, as if discussing someone being told they'd been dropped from the village football team. He took it a lot better than you did. Oh yes, I answered, fighting to keep from screaming at her. And where exactly were the two of you when he took the news so well? No answer. And exactly what were the two of you doing when you gave him the news, Maddie? Carried on. Or had you already finished? Still no answer. I'll see you when you get back home, Maddie, I announced to the silent phone. Then we'll decide whether this is still your home or not. I heard a click, as this time Maddie put the phone down on me. I got Beth up in the morning, prepared her favorite breakfast, and took her off to the dancing lessons she went to every Saturday morning. There, I arranged for one of the other mothers to pick her up and keep her for a while if I didn't make it back on time. Maddie normally picks her up, but she's been away for a couple of nights, I explained, wondering how long it would be before the truth got out. That's okay, the other mum told me. Beth can stay with us all day if you want to have some catch-up time with Maddie. Thanks, I said. I think I actually managed to smile, but I'm not sure. 15 minutes later, I was back at our house, my heart missing a beat as I saw Maddie's car already parked in her normal place outside. I hadn't wanted it this way, but what the hell, what difference would it make? Where's Beth? Demanded Maddie sharply when I closed the door. Where do you think? I answered brusquely. You haven't done anything stupid, have you, James? She virtually accused me. Depends on whether taking her to her dancing lessons is stupid or not. Oh. Oh yes. Sorry, I forgot. Maddie mumbled in embarrassment. Okay, so round one to me, but there was a long way to go. Look, James. She started off again. Tom's been really good about all this mess and made me realize that I'm not being very fair to you. If we can just sit down and talk this all through, then we both think that we can come up with something that works for all three of us. I presume you mean all four of us, Maddie, I pointed out. Aren't you forgetting Beth? Yes, of course, James, Maddie rushed in with. Of course, I mean all four of us. So, round two to me as well. I was scoring points, but the future didn't sound too rosy. I gestured for her to carry on. The fact is, James, that I truly do love you and always will. But now Tom's back. Everything's changed, hasn't it? How's that? I don't think I ever stopped loving him, James, my wife explained to me. I'm so sorry, James, but I'm in love with two men. Trouble is, I decided to remind her, the other one has a bigger cock than your husband. James, she cried out. I didn't mean to say that. I was angry and lost my temper and honestly didn't mean to say that. It's true though, isn't it? So what? Maddie sobbed. What difference does that make? I've never complained about your performance and never will. Damn right you never will, I rebuffed her. You never will because you'll never get the chance to compare us again. Please, James, she continued desperately, not giving up. Please just at least listen to what Tom and I have worked out. Please listen, James. I shrugged my shoulders, half agreeing to listen, and in a more confident voice she carried on. We, Tom and I that is, thought that we could work out some arrangement between the three of us. I could keep on living here with you and Beth so that we'd be like a little family, and Tom would get a flat or something nearby. So that you could visit him, I suppose? I asked in disbelief. Yes, of course. But I'd spend most nights here with you, James. But half the nights with him and his monster cock. It's not a monster, James, and it wouldn't be half the nights either, Maddie mumbled, realizing that things weren't going well. You really expect me to go for that, Maddie? I asked quietly. You get the best of both worlds. Tom gets his freedom with a regular supply of pussy, and I get to be the cuckold, probably supporting the lot of us. I guess not, she whispered. Not when you put it that way. I tell you what, Maddie, I began to offer. You ring Tom now and tell him to bugger off back to Leeds, and I might, and I repeat might, take you back. Doesn't sound like a very promising offer to me, James, Maddie replied sadly. It's the best I can do, Maddie, I told her firmly, still very unsure that I even wanted her to go for it. I guess I'll have to pass then, James. Close the door behind you when you leave, won't you? I thought I'd ended it with, what about Beth? Maddie then asked. She'll have to live with me and Tom. Over my dead body, Maddie, was my spiteful reply. I'd do anything to stop that happening. We'll see, James. Maddie smiled at me. If you think you can keep Beth, then you've got some surprises coming. Piss off, Maddie. I spat at her hatefully. Go back to your jailbird lover. No court in the world would give you custody while you're with that loser. Maddie said nothing more, just stood up, walked out and left. Oh yes, and she did shut the front door, and in fact nearly took it off its hinges. Game, set, and match to me? I didn't think so. In fact, I had an awful suspicion that the game had hardly started. I heard nothing from the pair of them for the next 4 or 5 days. It was a bit like sitting there in the trenches in the First World War, waiting for the next salvo or major attack to overrun me. I did take advantage of going to see a Tim, mate of mine who was also my solicitor, only to leave with my absolute certainty that any court in the world would award me custody of Beth, a little in tatters. 50-50, he advised me mournfully. If she can prove she's in a stable relationship, then the court could come down on her side. But he's a bloody jailbird, I tried to point out. He damn well murdered someone. Wasn't true, of course, but even Tim didn't know that. He killed someone in an accident, James, my friend informed me. He's paid his price to society and has the same rights as anyone else. What's he like? Does he look a bit dodgy or anything? Is there anything we can use against him? No idea, I had to admit. I've never met him, never seen him. Perhaps you should, James. All this time I had been killing Beth with kindness and attention, coming up with a variety of excuses as to why her beloved mummy wasn't there for her. When is mummy coming home, Daddy? She asked me sleepily. Soon, sweetheart, I told her, unable to face up to telling her the truth yet. I miss mummy. So do I, sweetheart, I replied with tears in my eyes as I cuddled her desperately. And I did. Oh God, how I missed that woman. I was to meet up with this Tom character more easily and perhaps sooner than I'd imagined, when I got a call from my pal to attend a meeting with the other parties, as he put it, and their solicitor. I put on a brave front as I walked into the meeting, surprised to see what this Tom bugger actually looked like. Come on now, biker guy, Hell's Angel and all that. I'd expected Tom to be some greasy, long-haired waster. The tall, clean-cut, fair-haired, somewhat slim and athletic man that confronted me took me by surprise. Hello, James. He greeted me with a nervous smile on his face, as he held his hand out to shake my hand. Sorry we have to meet like this. In fact, I'm sorry about the whole damn thing. Oh shit, I really wanted to hate the guy, and I found myself accepting his hand and shaking it. At least I didn't smile too much, and maybe this wouldn't be so difficult as I was expecting. Oh, how wrong I was. Mr. Dawson, their solicitor, an overweight, smirky sort of bastard, opened the proceedings. It's obvious that your wife isn't going to accept you back, so there's no point in you pursuing that avenue. Tim, my solicitor, shoved his hand out to hold me back from taking a swing at the Wally, and took up the challenge. I don't think my client is interested in that possibility either, he countered. As far as we are concerned, it is just a matter of deciding your client's access to the daughter of the marriage. Obviously my client will be the primary carer and she will live with him, but he is prepared to grant reasonable access to his soon-to-be ex-wife. Not that easy, Fatty replied with a smile that would have done a crocodile credit. My client, that is my clients, have a superior claim to the child. Rubbish, I cried out, but Tim motioned me to calm down again. The fact that my client Mrs. Dawson is the mother of the child is not under dispute, Fatty continued. Are we agreed on that? Tim acknowledged the fact, giving me a funny look, as puzzled as I was by the line the other guy was taking. Then we also have to acknowledge who the father is, the bugger continued, and this time Tim had to physically restrain me from confronting the arsehole. My clients maintain that Mr. Dawson is not the father of the child, but that her former boyfriend, Mr. Thomas Wellings, is the father. Tom? Tom is Beth's father? What bloody nonsense is that? I was so shocked that I just sat there with my mouth gaping open. We have documented proof, by way of medical evidence, that Mr. Wellings is 99.9% certain to be the child's natural-born father. We also have complementary evidence that your client Mr. Dawson couldn't possibly be the father. What rubbish are you saying? I screamed at the fat bastard. Beth is my daughter. I was there when she was born and I've brought her up. I. Apparently not, Mr. Dawson. Fatty cut across me. You may have bought her up as your daughter, but you are not her real father. My client Mr. Wellings is. But that's not possible, I protested. He was in prison when Maddie got pregnant. I was there when she was born, for Christ's sake. It's just not possible. My clients have explained that Mr. Dawson, he carried on in a monotone. Apparently you were away in Canada when Mr. Wellings' mother died, and he was granted compassionate leave from prison to attend her funeral. My client Mrs. Dawson, at that time Miss Jones, also attended the funeral, and they, well, let's say they had the opportunity to reacquaint themselves. I felt the room begin to spin as I took in what he was telling me. I couldn't believe it, but somehow deep down I realized it could be possible. I was dark and, well, sort of stocky. Beth was growing up to be tall and slim and fair-haired, just like her dad. Oh shit. As the room reeled around me, Maddie burst into tears and ran from the room. Tom got up to follow her, but hesitated. I'm sorry, James, he said to me. I swear to you Maddie had no idea that you weren't Beth's father till she started to grow up and looked like me. Does that excuse her? I shouted at him. Does that make fucking you when she was virtually engaged to me acceptable? No, he agreed quietly, shaking his head. Maddie's got no excuse for her behavior, but I love her, always have, and, oh hell James, I'm just so sorry. With that, he turned on his heels and followed Maddie out of the office. Well, Mr. Dawson, the fat solicitor started up again. Can we get some agreement here? I've got a busy day, so if we could come to some suitable terms perhaps. Before I could react, Tim leapt to his feet and yelled at the other solicitor. Shut up, you miserable bastard. You say one more word and I swear I'll ram your nose through the other side of your face myself. Not very professional, commented Fatty snottily, but he stood up, gathered his papers and hurriedly shuffled out of the office. You'll be hearing from me. Sorry, James. My pal, my personal legal eagle sighed at me when he'd gone. I didn't see that one coming. No, nor did I. My story doesn't end there, but it might be worth mentioning at this point that the view of Maddie's back as she had rushed out of that office was the last time I ever clapped eyes on her. If I'd known that then, perhaps my actions over the next period of time might have been different, but then again on reflection, perhaps not. Tim rang his secretary and told her to cancel everything for the rest of the day, and despite her protestations, he gathered me up as it were, and virtually dragged me off in a daze to the nearest pub. There the pair of us sank the first 3 pints in the time it took to order them, and over the next hour or so, somewhat mysteriously, 5 or 6 of my best pals turned up to help me drink myself into oblivion. Can't remember the end of the evening or leaving. Can't remember much of the next day for that matter, my first coherent thought being the following morning. Waking up in a strange bed with an equally strange but very attractive female body cuddled up to me. I never quite worked out what the arrangement was, but if anyone paid her then it certainly wasn't me. Either way, the girl disappeared and I never saw her again. Or perhaps I did, but unless she was naked with the tattoo of a rose on her naughty bits, then I simply wouldn't have recognized her if she'd been right there in front of me. I guess that's what good friends are for. I won't pretend that a black cloud descended on me and I withdrew from the world. I'm the sort of guy who thinks his beer glass is half full, rather than half empty, and with that positive attitude I set forth to make a life for myself. Okay, the black cloud was there sure enough, but I did try my best. I dated everything that came my way, whether pretty or not, but found myself going for women with children, single mothers or divorced. As you may imagine, this made me pretty popular and I got my just reward pretty frequently, but the only one of them that I started to grow feelings for dumped me when she accused me of only wanting me for her daughter. That's right, I was trying, perhaps too hard, to replace my daughter Beth. I was trying to find a partner with a Beth substitute. Crazy. Yes, I know, but that's how it got to me. Eventually, I recognized my problem and I attempted to regulate it. Cut down on the number of women I dated, but that was no bad thing. What about Beth herself, you may ask quite reasonably. And yes, I did insist on access to her, despite there being no actual blood connection between us. But that was a damn disaster. Maddie and Tom had moved back to Leeds and I had to travel up one weekend to visit with her. Neither Maddie or Tom had raised any objection, to be fair to them, and indeed had done everything to make my trip easier. It was Tom that I talked to every time I rang, and it was Tom that greeted me when I arrived to pick up Beth, Maddie having perhaps wisely made herself scarce. But it didn't go well. Poor Beth was just so confused and spent the whole day trying to persuade me to come and live with them, unable at her tender age to understand just how unlikely that was to ever happen. She just went on and on about it, and couldn't accept that Daddy didn't love Mummy anymore, repeatedly telling me how nice Daddy Tom was, and how happy I would be there. When I took her back, she started crying when she realized that I was about to leave her. She clung on to me, bawling her eyes out and having a tantrum. In the end, Tom had to pull her away from me and hold her while I ran from the house, my tears matching those of poor Beth. It was terrible and broke my heart yet again, perhaps worse than previously. It was the most awful decision that I'd ever made in my life, but I vowed there and then that there would be no more visits. I couldn't put little Beth through that agony again, and I didn't think that I could put myself through it either. When I told Tom of my decision, he actually tried to get me to change my mind, saying they'd do all they could to make it less traumatic next time. But deep down we both knew that it had to be for the best. Eventually we sort of agreed that I'd give it 6 months to give Beth time to settle down in her new life, and then we'd see. We agreed that, but we both knew what that really meant, and that was that for her sake I would no longer feature in her life. Maybe when she was grown up, I promised myself. Maybe when she graduated or something. I promised myself all sorts of things. But the reality was that I was totally on my own again. Memories of my wife and daughter being just that. Memories! I'll be forever grateful that I wasn't of a suicidal disposition. Life went on, as it has a tendency to do so, and my painful memories faded somewhat. Time, they say, is a wonderful cure, but I can assure you that it is no miracle cure. You have to work at it, and work at it I did, carving myself back out another new life. When the first Christmas came along, I couldn't let it pass without doing something. I went out and bought a present for Beth and sent it off, not knowing how to sign it or say who it was from, not wanting to restart the old heartache. It was with some surprise that the week after Christmas I got a letter from Leeds. Yes, Beth wrote me a little letter of thanks and told me a few things about her life. Obviously some adult had helped her, and somehow I felt sure that the someone was Tom and not my ex-wife. I did wonder if she even knew that the letter had been sent, but didn't let myself dwell on that possibility. In the letter she called me Daddy James. I know that meant that I'd been relegated and that Daddy was no doubt now Tom, but it actually cheered me up a whole load, confident that Beth had 2 parents that loved her, and that I had a name that she would maybe always remember me by. Daddy James. I continued to send her presents every birthday and Christmas, and continued to receive thank you letters from her and photographs, noticing with pride how her handwriting improved over the next couple of years or so. Often Tom would pop a little note in himself just to tell me about how well she was doing at school or dancing lessons or whatever, but no mention was ever made of me visiting again. I must have harbored secret hopes that we would meet up again soon, but after a year or so, Beth mentioned her little baby brother in one or her letters, and I accepted that I'd better not push my involvement any further. Tom and Maddie then had 2 children, and I was no part of that family. Now, not surprisingly, my pal Tim's wife had a friend. Well, she had quite a few friends, of course, but you know what I mean. Her name was Sally. She was a solicitor, a couple of years younger than me, dark-haired and slim with the most fantastic pair of legs I ever did see. The fact that I'm even mentioning her here obviously means that Sally became something special, so many of our interests coinciding that it was as if we were always meant to be. Eventually, I popped the question. We were both divorced, gainfully employed, and quite simply in love. Oh yes, the sex was pretty damn good as well, in case you were wondering. Oh, James, she answered me, a big smile on her face. I'd love to. But there was a but. Unspoken, but unquestionably a but. What's up, Sally? I asked, surprised to be honest that there might be a but. I know your history, James, she replied quietly. You'll want children, won't you? Of course I will, Sally. I grinned back at her. At least 2, maybe more. But I can't have children, James, she shocked me with. That's why my last marriage broke up. My ex was desperate to have a son to keep his family line going. You never told me that, I whispered, remembering that her ex-husband David had been some sort of minor baronet or something, which is why a son would be so important. Whose fault was it? Oh, mine, James. We were tested and David was okay. But my eggs weren't quite what they should be. Not impossible, but not very likely. And he ended your marriage just for that? I asked in surprise. David always seemed such a nice, reasonable sort of guy whenever I've met him. No, it wasn't just that, Sally answered me a little sadly. But it was that little problem that led to the arguments and eventually to our divorce. I'm so sorry, Sally. I didn't have a clue. Couldn't you have adopted or something? I would have, but David's family were dead set against it, and in the end it drove a wedge between us.
Sad, he commented.
Very sad, she agreed. But then I wouldn't have met you, would I? So you will marry me then? I sprung on her. The conversation went on, Sally worrying that she didn't want another marriage failing for the same reason, and me trying to assure her that I would accept it. We talked about possible adoption or other artificial means. That Sally with her past history knew a lot more about than me. In truth, there really were an awful lot of things to think about, and neither of us were getting any younger. "Why don't you ask me again in 3 months' time?" Sally at last suggested. "When you've had time to think about it. How about I leave the question on the table, and you give me your answer in 3 months?" I countered. "Before if you want." And that's how we left it. I wanted her to say yes, but deep down I had to admit that I had reservations. I really, really wanted a child of my own. More than one, to be honest, and adoption and all that stuff left me feeling a little uncertain. So uncertain, unfortunately, that tiny cracks began appearing in our relationship where none had been before, and where there simply didn't need to be any. There was no question of us breaking up or anything, and we were still very happy together. But there were doubts, and the marriage question got put quietly on the back burner. Every cloud has a silver lining, they say. Maybe that's true and maybe not. I certainly wasn't thinking of clouds that morning as I sat in my office wondering how the hell to justify a large expenditure on a new project I was fronting. The last thing I wanted was a phone call to interrupt my chain of thoughts, especially one that had no connection to my pet project. "Mr. Dawson?" asked he unfamiliar and rather officious-sounding voice. "Mr. James Dawson? That's me," I replied casually, my concentration still on how I could make $250,000 look like pocket money. "I have to ask you a couple of security questions, Mr. Dawson." "Fine." I went back, still a bit miffed at the interruption. "But first of all, who are you?" "Sorry." The voice came back, sounding anything but sorry. "My name is Mrs. Murphy from Headingley Social Services. Headingley is a suburb of Leeds." "I'm perfectly aware of where Headingley is, Mrs. Murphy," I replied, my interest suddenly increasing tenfold. "What can I do for you?" "You are Mr. James Edward Dawson?" "That's me." "And you were previously married to Mrs. Madeline Dawson, who subsequently became Mrs. Wellings?" "That's me," I repeated, getting a little annoyed with her officiousness. "As a security, could you tell me your ex-wife's middle name, please?" "Jean," I replied. Happy with that, she also asked me what her date of birth were, which of course I answered correctly again. "What's this all about?" I demanded somewhat more forcibly. Headingley Social Security Services are charged with sorting out some outstanding matters concerning the late Mrs. Wellings. "The late Mrs. Dawson?" I queried, realizing immediately that would have been Tom's mother. "But she died several years ago and I never met the woman." "What could that have to do with me?" "On the contrary, Mr. Dawson," the voice came back. "Mrs. Wellings died 6 days ago. She was killed in a motorbike accident along with her husband." "What?" "She can't have done." She. They." My voice petered out as the impact of her words sank in. I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson," the Social Security lady continued. "I thought you would have known." "What about Beth?" I cried out aloud, as the terrible possibilities shot through my brain. "She's all right, isn't she? Please tell me she's okay." "She's somewhat upset, sir," the woman continued, the slightest trace of humanity appearing for the first time. "She wasn't involved in the accident, but she's obviously very upset. She's been asking for you, but it's taken us a few days to track you down." "Where is she?" I all but shouted down the phone. "I'm leaving now. I'll come and get her." The woman told me that they had her and the address, and 5 minutes later I was in my car and leaving the car park. My oh-so-important project forgotten. I was as nervous as hell as I sat in Mrs. Murphy's rather dingy office, having convinced her that I really was who I was, and that there was no question whatsoever that I wanted Beth. Somewhat to my surprise, I discovered that Tom and Maddie had done nothing to change anything, and of course I'd heard nothing about a request for adoption. As far as the law was concerned, I was still legally Beth's father, as that's what it said on her birth certificate. Fancy that. I guess I was upset to hear of Maddie and Tom's demise, even considering what she had done to me. But I was simply so excited to be seeing Beth again, that such thoughts or feelings simply hadn't seeped through yet. But there was something else that I hadn't thought of as well. Eventually there was a tap on the door, and another woman walked into the room holding Beth's hand. My Beth. The first time I'd seen her for nearly 4 years. Daddy, is that really you? Beth asked timidly. Not surprisingly, as though I'd had photos of her sent to me. She hadn't seen me since she'd been 4 years old. Yes, it's me, sweetheart. I choked the words out, the first single tear running down my cheek, and holding my arms out to her. Daddy, Daddy, she cried out as she ran to me. I've missed you. I knew you'd come for me. I told you that there was something else I'd completely forgotten about, and it was as I cuddled my daughter in my arms that omission suddenly became apparent. As I tried to lift Beth up in my arms, something was not quite right. Looking down, to my surprise, I spotted another little chap clinging on grimly to Beth's skirt for all he was worth. Oh shit.
Ide furguten.
Beth had a little brother. This is Jimmy, Beth introduced me, when I let her down again, not wishing to frighten the poor little chap by winning the tug of war. Even so, the poor little fella looked as if he was about to burst into tears. He was about 3 years old or so, and looked a right little tyke, dark-haired and solidly built, looking like a potential future rugby player. He was obviously frightened to death, but was holding on bravely, unsure what the future held. Hello, Jimmy? I smiled at him reassuringly, but he glared back still unsure. This is Daddy James, Jimmy, Beth encouraged her little brother. Say hello. Daddy James, what used to be your real daddy? He asked Beth, but not taking his eyes off me. Yes, Jimmy, she told him. Mummy and Daddy always told us how nice he was, and now he's going to be our daddy and take us away to live with him. Mrs. Murphy opened her mouth to speak, no doubt wishing to correct that innocent statement as nothing had been discussed concerning Jimmy. But I held up my hand to stop her, and she had the good sense to keep quiet. My mummy and daddy have gone to heaven, little Jimmy spilled out. Will you really be our new daddy? How old are you, Jimmy? I asked, a thought suddenly occurring to me as I looked at the little lad. Free, he told me. Free and, at which point he looked up at his older sister for help. He's 3 and 4 months, Beth finished for him. His birthday is on the 7th of November. Well, bugger me, I cried out as the truth became clear. The mathematics weren't difficult at all. 3 years and 4 months plus another 9 months, and that took us back to mid-October. Yes, over a month before Tom was released for prison some 4 years previously. Coupled with Jimmy's build and complexion, there was no doubt in my mind. Jimmy was my son. For Christ's sake, they must have known, and even called him Jimmy after me. No wonder Maddie had not been there the single time I'd visited, as she must have been showing by then. Come and give your dad a cuddle, little man. I grinned at him, a warm feeling coursing through me. He hesitated just a moment and leapt into my arms, closely followed by Beth, and the 3 of us cuddled and cried, oblivious to the others around us. It was plain sailing after that. I obviously had the legal right to take Beth away, and it took just 10 minutes in front of a hastily sought-out judge to be given the right to take Jimmy as well. Of course, there would be paperwork to do later, but I knew a certain solicitor lady who I hoped might be happy to help me with that. This is my friend Sally. I introduced my 2 new charges the very next day, noting that her eyes were already misting up. Are you going to be our new mummy? Piped up little Jimmy. Shush, Jimmy, Beth admonished her brother. Daddy said that the lady was a friend of his. Sally looked at the pair of them for a few moments before saying anything, while I held my breath. That's okay, Beth. She eventually managed to get out as her tears started rolling. If your daddy still wants me, then I think you 2 are the answer to our prayers, and I'd love to be your new mummy. Well, the offer was still on the table and the 3 months weren't up, so you can guess how it all ended up, can't you? That afternoon, Sally and I took the 2 of them out for the day, and we held hands, ran together, played together, laughed together, and looked together. Yes, that's right, we went to the damn zoo again. There were, of course, difficult times in the following months and years, as my 2 children remembered Tom and Maddie, who had been their parents. But time is indeed a healer, and those times passed, as our children grew up and Sally and I started to happily grow older together. Beth did become a vet and happily married to a young civil engineer, and we are expectantly waiting for the first grandchildren. Jimmy joined the Royal Air Force and has just got his wings. I wonder if his love of airplanes came from the number of times that we dragged one another to Old Warden to see the museum there. Well, that's it, and I hope you enjoyed reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. If you did, then please let me know. If not, well, I suppose you'll let me know anyway.